Thanks so much, Rabbi, and thanks to you all for being here and for participating in this program this morning. My name is Erwin Goldman, and it's an honor for me to be the moderator today. So we might ask, and I think we have tried to ask throughout the year, if science and spiritual practice are two contradictory sources of truth in the world, or if they are compatible. Can you practice them simultaneously in an integrated way? And that has been a theme throughout this whole program. The Rabbi introduced and thanked many of the people who were part of this program, and I'm very, very grateful that we've had such a robust conversation over the year, and particularly grateful to Matt Banks, who spearheaded the program. And as we've explored this sort of liminal space in between these domains, science and spirituality, we've had book discussions and public lectures and retreats and lots of conversations. We've learned a lot about how science and spirituality overlap and the places that they appear distinct. And so today we're going to conclude our year-long program with a lecture by nationally renowned scholar Hava Tirosh Samuelson, and we're going to have a panel discussion that's going to cover lots of the areas that were part of our discussion during the year. A lot of traditional religious thinkers have suggested that science and religion are separate manifestations of the same divine truth. And of course, there are Talmudic arguments that include the idea that an understanding of nature, such as an understanding of the planetary movements or the Jewish calendar, is a way to appreciate God's work. And some of us may accept that easily. Others may have difficulty reconciling that idea with how we see the complexity and the diversity of nature, especially if we see it as the result of a directionless and opportunistic process. And yet we're pulled towards science and spirituality as ways of knowing and understanding. We're a people of ancient traditions, but also modern and educated and integrated into our larger communities, into a world of rationalism, and we struggle sometimes to integrate how our lives can be explained entirely within the confines of the natural world. Sometimes we carve out specific compartments in our experience to contain our religious practice and keep it separate. So dismantling some of those things is one of the goals of our program. It's one of the opportunities that we have through this wonderful year that we've explored. And so to help guide us today and to start our program, we're very fortunate to have Hava Tirosh Samuelson with us. And she is Regents Professor, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, the Director of Jewish Studies, and Professor of History at Arizona State University. She's also taught at a number of other universities, including Indiana University, Emory, Columbia, and Hebrew Union College. She is a Jewish intellectual historian who focuses on the interplay of philosophy and mysticism, Judaism and science, and Judaism and ecology. She's the author of 2 books and the editor of many volumes, including Judaism and Ecology, Created World, and Revealed World. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers, a series of 20 books featuring outstanding Jewish thinkers today. And her work explores the interplay of religion, science, and technology with a focus on transhumanism and the relationship between Judaism, science, and medicine. I'd like to present Professor Tirosh Samuelson, who's going to talk today about Jews, Judaism, and science in historical perspective.
So most of the things I'm probably going to tell you are known to you, but it will give us some way to enter into the conversation during the panel discussion. So when I'm going to speak about science,
excuse me, could you use a microphone? We cannot hear you.
Even though I have a big voice. All right.
You can also use this if you prefer.
Let's see. How's that?
How about the lapel mic?
if
It's
I'm too
recording.
fast, just,
It is recording.
let
Oh,
me
because
know.
it's green. Okay.
I'm going to stop
Good.
now, and
Thank
I
you.
have exactly 30 minutes to cover about 3,000 years, so we'll manage somehow. So basically, we have three models. We already heard them in the introductory comments. The conflict model, the compartmentalization model, and the congruence model, or what you call here compatibility models. Basically, it's self-explanatory. The conflict model looks at Judaism and science as two very different and perhaps even clashing worldviews. The compartmentalization model treats Judaism and science as different but non-overlapping domains of life. The congruence model or compatibility model holds that Judaism and science are interdependent and there is some form of integration. So we'll try to figure out how those models operated in the long history of the Jewish tradition. I will do it historically because I'm a historian, so part one is about the pre-modern world, part two is the early modern world, basically 16th and 18th centuries, and part three is the 19th century and the 20th century, namely the modern world. My argument is going to be that the separation between Judaism and science is basically a modern phenomenon. It's part of secularization and modernization. It's not what happened prior to the 19th century. And maybe the reason that we have a program such as this, the science, what is it called, Scientists in Synagogues, this program is a response to a problem. It's a way to solve a problem, at least a perceived problem. So let's start with the pre-modern world. How far should we go back? Well, in some ways, we need to say a few words at least about the Hellenistic world, because that's when Judaism really encounters, or Jews encounter Greek science in some way. All Jews in the pre-modern world, or in the ancient world, all Jews were Hellenized. Nobody was non-Hellenized. So all Jews are Hellenized, but not to the same degree. Greek-speaking Jews, especially in Egypt, are responding to it by creating the first rethinking of Judaism, which Judaism at the time meant basically a scriptural religion, or rethinking scripture in light of Greek philosophy. The major example, of course, is Philo, and it's amazing, and in my view, as a historian, somewhat tragic, that Philonic Judaism is not the Judaism that survived among Jews. So Philo, in a sense, gives us a way of being a Jewish scientist, a Jewish philosopher, and very much a Jewish person, very committed to scripture. But Philo is not normative Judaism. So what happened is, as you know, of course, Philo became the foundation of a Christian approach. Philo is understood as a Christian church father, where the Jews are, most Jews, I should say, not familiar with Philo. So what became Judaism is Rabbinic Judaism, and Rabbinic Judaism took a much more critical response or attitude toward Greek philosophy and science, and there are many ways to explain why that was the case. One way of looking at it is Greek science is understood as part of the oppressive political regime, so if you're going to reject that policy or that politics, you have to reject the culture that comes with it. The rabbis themselves did not encourage cosmological speculations, did not encourage study of nature for its own sake, that's for sure. And if they engaged in it, they did so in the privacy of their yeshivot, privacy of their academies. It was not for ordinary Jews. If you look at what the rabbi speaks, or who the rabbi speaks against, primarily as far as Greek philosophy is concerned, we only know about one philosophical tradition, and that's Epicureanism. Only the Epicureans are the people that the rabbis feel that they need to distance themselves from. Those of you who know Hebrew would know that you need to know what to say, what to speak against, or how to speak, how to respond to the Epicureans. What's wrong with them? Well, they are atheists. They believe that the material world is the only reality, that the world is made of atoms that simply reconfigure over time, and that the gods have no interest in the affairs of humankind, of human beings. The Epicureans held that there is no soul, no life after death, no meaning to history, no transcending purpose to life. Epicurean morality advised people how to live. A lot of it is really about ethics. Do not make emotional commitments. Do not pledge your life in marriage or suffer the burdens of bearing children, God forbid. There is only one life, so do not invest your energy on the wrong thing. Do not involve yourself in public life. Cultivate solitude. Live day by day. And end your life at the time and place of your own choosing. So it's against this that Rabbinic Judaism positions itself. And it says, no, we are not this. What are we about? We are about what we historians of religious studies call theism. Theism actually means a belief in a personal God, a God who created the world and created the human being in the image of God. A human being is a person who has interdependence of body and soul. At death, the soul continues to enjoy the bliss of the afterlife, at least according to the Pharisees, according to the Pushim, not necessarily according to the Tzdukim. But provided you continue that tradition, provided one lives rightly by observing the revealed Torah. So basically, Rabbinic Judaism offers to us a worldview in which the Torah itself defines the structure, the meaning, the purpose of human life, and the very observance of Torah ensures human well-being, or if you want to call it, happiness. The life of Torah itself is not about understanding, it's about interpretation. So one way of looking at Judaism and science is to say Judaism is not about explaining the world, it's about interpreting the world, about trying to figure out what makes sense and how to live rightly according to divine command. If I had to choose one verse in the Torah that recaptures the Judaic perspective, I would say, "Etz chaim hi lamachzikim ba v'tomcheha me'ushar." The Torah is a tree of life, and those who adhere to it are happy. So that's, in a sense, the two worldviews that are operating here. All this, you can ask, has nothing to do with science. So if you ask yourself, where is science in Rabbinic Judaism? I would say that it's there in a very kind of, it's a trace. It's non-systematic. It is fused with myth, exegesis, ethics, folk literature, mysticism, and theurgy. Theurgy means the capacity of the human being to impact God. That's what theurgy means. And you can find all of it in Rabbinic texts. So in Rabbinic texts, science is there kind of in the background. There is no real discussion of scientific information, even though you can use scientific information, especially mathematical information, which you may argue is not necessarily science, but most do it, to determine the extent of the Eruv, that's ritual enclosure, to establish a floor plan of a sukkah, to determine the calendar, to tabulate mixtures of grain. So you can use scientific information, but that's not where the action is in Rabbinic Judaism. Where the action is always to look at the moral lesson. What's the moral lesson? And that's true if you look also at what the rabbis were doing as far as observing the natural world. They live in an environment that is suffused, they're in a pastoral environment, in an agricultural environment. So they look at what's going on around them. They're not interested in explaining processes. They're interested in teasing out the moral significance of what they see. So if you ask them, how do they treat nature? They treat nature, animals, plants, as moral example to follow, as they understand it. Primarily within the realm of nature, the rabbis care about the human body. There's a lot of information about the working of the human body, but it's always subsumed under what really matters. So when does science start for Jews? I would say science starts for Jews only in the 10th century. And why is that? It's only then because they have to respond to the challenge of Islamic civilization. The Jews by that time are all living, or at least 80% of them are living in an Islamic or in the orbit of Islam. They are no longer farmers. They have moved into other practices. Economically, they are into commerce, trade, and finance. Socially, they are urban people, so they undergo a major process of urbanization, and they are kind of distanced in some ways from the natural world. Culturally, also major changes. They don't speak Aramaic anymore. They can read it. They can, of course, can write it, but they don't speak it. They now speak Arabic, and that forces them to respond to the rise of Islamic rationalism, which was internalized with the Karaite critique of rabbinic Judaism. So basically, science begins in Judaism, scientific activity begins with kind of an apologetic stance. They have to explain, why is rabbinic Judaism making sense? It's not really rational. A lot of things in rabbinic Judaism are not rational. So if you're going to rationalize Judaism, you have to use philosophy and science. So in the Middle Ages, what happens? Science becomes a Jewish activity, but it's cultivated by a very small class of people. We know a good number of people who are involved in it. Scientific education is going to require from Jews to read non-Jewish texts, primarily Greek and Hellenistic texts translated into Arabic and then into Hebrew. So that's how they get their science. It's always through a mediation of a Muslim interpreter. And the cultivation of science would enable the Jews to function through the Middle Ages and later as cultural mediators. So science is always a form of cultural mediation. A big point I would like to press to you is that does not mean engagement, or that does not mean secularity. There's nothing secular about the engagement of science in the Middle Ages, nothing. Science is invested with religious meaning on the one hand, and science is inseparable from philosophy, and you cannot talk philosophically in the Middle Ages. You cannot talk philosophy without mentioning God. How you interpret God, what God means, and how you understand it philosophically, that's another issue. But basically, science is understood as a religious occupation. So what I will show you, that the character that I'd like to spend 2 minutes on is, I'm going to speak about Maimonides, who's known to all of us. In a sense, Maimonides and all those people who followed him, you can call them all the Maimonideans, all those who followed him, basically looked at engagement with science as a religious activity. Before that, maybe one word or 2 words on science as a social practice. Where did Jews study science? There's no university that they can go to. They're not accepted into the universities once universities open in the 13th century. You study science from books. So scientific activities is always a matter of reading books. It's not about experimentation, definitely not experimentation. It's not even about observation. It's mostly about interpretation of text, mainly the text of Aristotle and his Muslim interpreters. How do they make a living? They make a living primarily in medicine. Scientists are going to make a living either as physicians, or some of them as financiers. Some will be land surveyors, diplomats, astronomers, and astrologers. Astrology is very big in the Middle Ages. It's a science. It's understood as astronomy in practice, taken very seriously. The best Jewish scientist in the Middle Ages, Synagogues, died in 1344, was also a very good and very well-known astrologer. So take astrology seriously if you want to study the Middle Ages. Within the medieval society, even the Jewish physician is always kind of an insider and an outsider. He works in the court because those who are in the courts, royal courts, are going to be privileged, even to the point of not being forced to wear the Jewish badge. The Jewish badge is instituted in 1215, but you can get away with it if you are a physician. But because you are kind of in a liminal position, you're a privileged Jew, but you are also a competitor. So the more we enter into the 13th century and 14th century, especially as far as the practice of medicine is concerned, we're going to see a lot of competition between Jewish physicians and non-Jewish physicians. Jewish physicians, by the way, were much more representative in the population than their actual number. But because they are quite successful in that regard, there's also a lot of anxiety and unease about their position. I'm more interested in saying a few words about the intellectual identity of the Jewish scientist, looking at Maimonides as my example. And here, what I want to bring to your attention is the fact that Maimonides really showed us how a Jew could be. And actually, Maimonides would go and tell us not only how you could be a Jew and a scientist, how you should be a Jew and a scientist. Now, in his day, of course, the science is Aristotelian science, which today, of course, doesn't work on many scientific grounds, but some elements of Aristotelian science are still relevant to us. But the bottom line for Maimonides is this. Maimonides recognizes that there are challenges between Aristotelian science and Judaism. For example, Aristotle posited that the world is eternal, as opposed to the world created. Aristotle explained the processes of nature as immanently teleological. It's a necessary teleology. Judaism doesn't. Judaism allows for divine will to intervene. Aristotle spoke about God as necessary being rather than as personal being. And Aristotle regarded the intellect as that which makes us who we are as humans. So Maimonides is aware of all those differences. But he's going to argue and he's going to show us how we need to totally reinterpret Rabbinic Judaism in order to absorb and respond to Aristotelian science. And that's what he does in the Guide to the Perplexed. I'm just interested, how many people actually in the room, since you're all academics here, or most of you, how many people actually read the Guide to the Perplexed? About a third, maybe a fourth, something like that. That's much higher than in the general Jewish population. Most people know about it, but never really bothered to look at it. It's the most perplexing book ever written. It doesn't really explain things. What it does brilliantly, it forces you to enter into the interpretive process. It forces you to ask the question, but it really doesn't tell you how to think, because in many ways that's open still to interpretation. But what is the message? At least in my interpretation, which is only one out of many. Maimonides is telling us that we must not approach the biblical text literally. Any attempt to read the biblical text literally is misguided, because the Torah should be understood for its deep meaning, and the deep meaning of the Torah is philosophical. That means it's scientific. The Bible is a book of science, according to Maimonides, and it conveys abstract truth by using allegorical and metaphorical language. So we need to know how to read the Bible. And when we learn how to read the Bible according to Maimonides, we learn how physics and metaphysics are taught by the biblical text, of course, as interpreted by Maimonides. So that's point number one, which leads us to the next point. If you're going to be a good Jew, Maimonides tells us you must be a philosopher and you must be a scientist. To do less than that is to undermine your own Jewishness. And the third point is you have to think about the connection between philosophy and science and politics. Because to engage in philosophy and science, you need the right political system. If the politics or the polity is not right, if it forces you to do something non-scientific, you've got a problem. So what Maimonides is arguing, he's arguing that the Torah actually created the best political system within which we can aspire to be what we're supposed to be. And what that means for Maimonides is, again, open to interpretation. But minimally, you can say that Maimonides believe that the Torah enables us to get on the path toward tikkun haguf and tikkun hanefesh, the well-being of the body and the well-being of the soul. And there's much more to it. If you want to read my book about happiness, happiness in Brahman and Judaism, there's a whole chapter on Maimonides that explains basically how his system, very complex system, actually works. But I believe he honestly believes that Judaism is the right political structure that enables us to be good philosophers and good Jews. Maimonides died well before. After he died, there was a major controversy, which we call the Maimonidean controversy. It lasted for at least 100 years. 1306, it ended with a ban on the study of philosophy and science. Jews actually placed a ban on Maimonides' books. But the ban was active or relevant only to people under 25 years. So a lot of the learning was done before that. Bottom line, the ban didn't succeed. Bottom translated. Most of the scientific activity in the Middle Ages actually happened after Maimonides died, especially during the 14th century, where Jews really absorbed the writings of Averroes or Ibn Rushd, the Muslim interpreter of Maimonides. So here you go. I'm ending the medieval, basically the medieval period gives us a model how to be a Jew and to be a philosopher, how those two paradigms are compatible and necessary. Very quickly, I'm moving into the second period, which may be less known to us, but it's more complicated, the early modern period. And in the early modern period, what we see is on the one hand, continuation of the process of Jews as working as scientists and physicians in courts. Which courts? As you know, the Jews were expelled from Western Europe, a series of expulsions, but by the beginning of the 15th century, Western Europe is basically clear of Jews, especially after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and from Portugal, that's 1492, 1497. Where do we find the Jews? We find them in Italy, and we find them in North Africa, we find them in the Ottoman Empire, and we find them more and more in Central Europe. So in the Ottoman court and in the Habsburg court, we're going to find Jews as physicians, as scientists. In Ottoman court, it's primarily as physicians. In the Rudolphine court, in the Habsburg Empire, the court of Emperor Rudolf II, 1552, 1612, we find Jews engaged in the new sciences, namely in astronomy. But the interesting thing, maybe the kind of not so glamorous thing to say, the Jews were not at the forefront of the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century. Absolutely not. They responded to it. They were not at the forefront of it. But yet something about the Jews really was very attractive to non-Jews. What was it? The answer is Kabbalah. Jews and their knowledge of Kabbalah was the reason why the Maharal of Prague, the law of Prague, became a celebrity in this court of Rudolf II. So why Kabbalah? I have to say something about Kabbalah. I've written quite a lot about it and the relationship between Kabbalah and science. So it's a complicated thing, but if I'm trying to kind of get to the heart of it is that Kabbalah gives you or tries to give you the grammar of reality. But reality is understood as a text. Reality is textual. And Kabbalah understands the grammar of that divine text, if you wish. The relationship between Kabbalah and science is complicated. In some ways, Kabbalah, you can say, engage people or enable people to enter into the new sciences. Because Kabbalah is interested in manipulation of the world through your knowledge of language. In other words, Kabbalah is engaged in magic. In the 16th century, 17th century, you couldn't talk about Kabbalah without talking about magic, without talking about alchemy. So if you're a Kabbalist and you know that stuff, you're going to be engaged in those practices, and I should say also astrology. So astrology, magic, alchemy, those are the three areas that Kabbalists were very, very involved in. I can tell you more about it if you wish in the Q&A section. But here, what we have here is, I want to say, how the Maharal of Prague, the Maharal really gave us kind of an opening to what's going to happen in the modern period. Basically, he said, if a Jew is a true Jew, it's not going to be a Maimonidean kind of Jew, it's going to be a Kabbalist. That Jew belongs to the level of the supernatural, whereas science, politics, business as usual, that's here. That's in the realm of the natural. So because the Maharal created this hierarchy between the natural and the supernatural, basically he said Judaism doesn't belong to the natural level. We are above it, he claims. We belong to the level of the supernatural that is directly governed by God. Now, if you think in those terms, let me show you that it can actually give you 3 or 4 even different approaches. You can say that science now is engaged for its own sake, but science has no religious significance, because that's not where the action is for religious people. Or 2, you can say science doesn't pose a challenge to religious Judaism, because they belong to very different levels of reality. Or you can say, since science has no religious importance, religious Jews could or ignore science. Or you can say, since all that matters is the natural world, known through science, scientifically informed Jews should not concern themselves with religion. So all of those logical possibilities emerge from this kind of hierarchy that the Maharal set up for us. Quickly, just keep in mind that what's happening in the early modern period, 16th to 18th century, is very important educationally. Jews are not going to be allowed to enter into the universities, something that they were not allowed in the Middle Ages. It's the fact that certain universities, University of Padua, University of Leiden, opened the doors to Jews, meant that we have the growth of a new kind of a Jew. And this kind of a Jew is going to be the precursor to the Maskilim, to the Jewish Enlighteners, those who were the advocates of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, in the 18th and 19th century. So with the Haskalah, we are going to enter, this is kind of toward modernity. Because of the Jewish Haskalah, we also have the reform of Judaism, the argument that Judaism needs to reform itself from within. And the reason it needs to be, how many minutes do I have, Irvin?
I would say try to wrap up in maybe 3 minutes or so.
3 minutes. All right.
Is that possible? If
Possible.
not,
So here you go. You have the possibility of the Haskalah as the pattern for the modern period. And in the modern period, we have the Jewish scientist as a new kind of a person. What's my take on the modern period? My take is that's in 3 minutes. So that's where you have the secularization of the engagement in science, something that did not happen previously. And because of secularization of science, we have a new image of science emerging in the modern period. According to this new image, science is technical. Science is independent from theology and philosophy. Science has its own method. Science did not require moral training or any kind of exceptional integrity. And science is very much part of the secular path toward modernity. That's when we begin to have the separation or the compartmentalization, when Jews embrace science as a way to be modern Jews. That's happening first in Germany and throughout Central Europe, and it's happening big time in America. I won't give you all the kind of evidence to what I'm saying, but we have the emergence of a new Jewish professional, and that new Jewish professional is not really interested, or at least not necessarily interested, in religious observance or even in participation in the Jewish community. Many Jews, which we now refer to as of Jewish descent or of Jewish heritage, are doing very well as scientists all over America, all over Europe, of course, but they're not contributing to the Jewish community necessarily. And many of them are actually uncomfortable being in a Jewish community. So to get to the end of it, where does that leave us? I can tell you more information about it, kind of think of what all the changes in America, for example, economic changes, how much money is required to do big science, how Jews are involved in all the capitalistic enterprises of the 20th century. And you'll understand why what we have in America especially is a new phenomenon that did not happen in the pre or early modern world. Where does that leave us? Basically, what I try to propose is that we need to go back to the medieval convergence model. We need to adapt it to the contemporary science. We need to do things that go both ways. What does it mean? It means that synagogues have to be open to scientists and scientific activity, scientific information. You cannot conduct Judaism as if science doesn't exist. Conversely, I don't think that science or scientific activity that is totally devoid of concern for Jewish issues is the way to go. If I look at an example how this can be done, I'm going to tell you a little bit. I'll share those flyers later, but there is is a society for the study of Judaism, science, and medicine. It was founded in 2008. It's located in ASU. I run it. We do conferences once a year. And that's kind of an attempt to show how it can be done in a contemporary, pluralistic, and interdisciplinary, global, or at least international kind of approach to Judaism and science. So I'm very glad that your program here is taking the problem seriously and offering us a way to respond to the problem. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for starting us off in such a nice way, Hava. We're very grateful, and I'd like to invite our panelists to join us here at the table, and I'll introduce them. So we brought together 3 panelists to reflect on some of the questions that Hava brought up in her presentation. Our remaining 2 panelists are Professor Richard Davidson, who's a professor of psychiatry and psychology at UW-Madison, and he serves as the director of the Laboratory for Effective Neuroscience and of the Weissman Lab for Brain Imaging and Behavior. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Health and Minds, where his work has become internationally recognized. His research is broadly focused on the neural basis of emotion and emotional style, as well as methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. Also on our panel is Professor Matt Banks, who's in the Department of Anesthesiology at UW-Madison, and is a nationally recognized neuroscientist. His lab studies how the brain is impacted by the loss of consciousness, such as during anesthesia, sleep, and certain disorders. And his lab investigates how neural circuitry is affected by consciousness, and the work has implications for understanding how to understand and modulate awareness. Matt, as you know, is also past president of Beth Israel Center, is well known to many in our community for his advocacy, meditation, and its role in our spiritual practice. So, as we begin now to interrogate the question of whether science and spiritual practice are 2 separate but compatible, or maybe separate but contradictory sources of truth in the world, I'd like to begin with Professor Richie Davidson and ask him the first question, and that is, can you tell us a bit about how you have brought together your work as a research scientist with clinical practices such as meditation, and how you see these ways of understanding as both working together and standing separately?
Thank you all for having me, and I really appreciate the aspiration of this program, and admire and applaud your efforts to bring these traditions. Is this better?
Yeah.
To bring these traditions together, and also Chava, thank you so much for your talk. I learned a lot that I had not previously known. So I'm a neuroscientist and psychologist by training, and I have been dancing at the intersection between science and spirituality for my entire professional life. I have been engaged in research around issues of human flourishing and well-being, which has really necessitated the serious interaction with and engagement with spiritual traditions. In my case, I'm one of those Jews that Chava talked about as being a cultural Jew, and I'm a Buddhist practitioner. So let me just say a little bit about how I think of this from that perspective. I very much found it helpful to hear Chava's description of these 3 ways in which science and religion or spirituality have related to one another. And I'm very much a subscriber to the third approach, where I firmly believe that they have important things to be engaged with one another. They really, from my perspective, there is one reality that can be approached through different traditions, but we really have one reality to grapple with. And I find science and spirituality to be complementary approaches, complementary ways of knowing this reality. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a very famous sutra called the Kalama Sutra, which is in the Pali Canon. And in this sutra, it basically says that we should not believe anything in the scripture by itself without first testing it in our experience. It represents the kind of empirical status of this particular tradition, and it is one that has resonated with me, and I think in part is one of the reasons why scientists have been historically, at least over in the modern era, particularly attracted to engagement with Buddhism, because it has this very explicit stance. And this is a stance that I find extremely compatible with science. I also believe that there are some values that are common in science and in all religious traditions. And one of them is a kind of radical honesty, a radical engagement with our own perception of the world. Both science and spiritual traditions, I think, ask us to see the world as it is, so to speak. There are certain mechanisms in science that we use to help us do that. And I also think that there are strategies within the spiritual traditions that serve the same function. And in that way, I have always felt that my life as a scientist and as a spiritual seeker have at their roots some very important common values that doesn't introduce any separation, but rather actually facilitates a kind of common synthesis. So maybe I'll stop here in these introductory comments. I'm sure we'll elaborate much more as we go along.
Thank you so much. That's a great place for us to start. You talked about the common values between science and spirituality in your response. And I'm wondering, and maybe I can direct this towards Matt Banks. Matt, would you be willing to share with us a little bit about your personal spiritual practice and how that practice either does or doesn't reconcile science and spirituality? Does it bring them closer together, or does it occasionally drive a wedge between those two domains? What has been your experience?
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to say I'm honored to be sitting on the podium with these two very eminent scholars, and I feel humbled and ever so slightly inadequate, but I'll do my best. I've always been Jewish, and ever since I was 10 years old, I knew I wanted to be a scientist. And so for me, because of my unity of experience, they've always been intimately intertwined. And so my path has been one in trying to discover their relationship and to see the connections between them. And I must say that that was not always an easy path. I think that one of the few advantages of now being in my 50s is that I've finally feel comfortable at least seeing a lot of those connections. For me, as Richie just put it beautifully, science and spirituality for me, my Jewish practice, are ways of seeing the world. They're sort of encourage us to see the world. They're both processes of discovery. They both also require a discipline. They have their own sort of mechanisms in which that process of discovery unfolds. But they're certainly related in that way. I think for me, one of the interesting confluences that I've had is by sort of exploring a Buddhist meditation practice as well as sort of more deeply my Jewish practice in turning to Kabbalah and to Chassidut, is that I've been able to see the relationship between certain concepts in neuroscience and in spiritual practice to make it more concrete. And I can just go over a couple of those. One of them is the notion that we construct reality in our minds, that we are active participants in our experience. And that is something that in neuroscience is very much a current and hot topic. And of course, it has a very long tradition in neuroscience that we are not just passive receivers of information, but that our experience is very much informed by our previous experience or expectations, and also by the finiteness and limits of our sensory apparatus. But it also obviously indicates that we're all experiencing reality in different ways. And so what that leaves the door open for there actually being some absolute reality that underlies all of this, and all of our experience is a manifestation of that absolute reality, but that we can usually just barely glimpse that in our day-to-day experience. And it's those glimpses that I find really interesting and that I think are much better informed by spiritual practice than they are by the scientific method. Because the scientific method is never going to allow for experiments that will enable us to prove the existence of this absolute reality, because it's always going to be limited by the fact that it's people doing the experiments. And so in that sense, what neuroscience has taught me is that there is at least this possibility, if not likelihood, that something exists that is beyond our ability to experience it under normal conditions. And spiritual practice actually provides a means to connect to that overarching reality. And I think possibly even more relevant, but certainly related to that is the notion of the self, that we have this very strong sense of self, of our own agency, of us as being independent creatures. But what science and psychology and also spiritual practice tell us is that those are, the idea of the self is really just a collection of stories that we tell in order to enable us to move through the world. And that a lot of our ills in this world revolve around the distortions of those stories. And so a lot of mental illness is related to a distorted sense of self and a distorted sense of our place in the world. And it's through both, again, scientific inquiry that we've been able to discover that, but it's through spiritual practice that we're able to reorient our notion of the self so that we can promote our own flourishing and that of others.
Thank you, Matt. You spoke about the limits of the scientific method, and I think that is a really interesting place maybe for us to explore just a little bit. I wonder, Richie, if you might, you also, I think in your discussion mentioned seeing the world as it is, and so perhaps is this limitation of science a place where is this a very, very fertile ground for the kinds of discussions we're having here
Yeah, so these are all wonderful questions, and let me say I really appreciate the way you frame things, Matt, which I very much resonate with. In terms of limits of science, I think that the honest answer is we don't know. We don't know what the limits are at this point in time. I think it's really important for us to not prematurely close the door on any account. I think one of the things that scientists today have a very difficult time with, which I try to help my students with, is to practice humility. To practice humility about both our understanding of the world and of the limits or possible reach of science. So I don't know what the limits are going to be. Surely there are some limits now, but there are lots of things that I can name right now that today we know as absolute facts with really a significant amount of certainty that I was taught as a student in graduate school were not true. And so one of the beauties of science is that it changes. It changes over time, and we get progressively better approximations of our understanding as science develops. One of the other things that Matt mentioned, which I'd like to just briefly comment on, is the notion that in spiritual practice we have these glimpses, which I also very much resonate with, and that because these glimpses are only accessible during these special moments of spiritual practice, it's somehow going to be off limits or difficult to reconcile with science. And one of the, a couple of years ago, I wrote a book with Daniel Goleman called Altered Traits. And the idea of altered traits is kind of a play on the term altered states. A lot of religious experiences are often described as altered states. And the idea in this book is that it actually is possible for these states to become enduring, so that they're no longer states, but they're modes of being, they're ways of being in the world. And there are living examples of people who I believe are in the world in this way. One of them is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He doesn't have altered states. He is in an altered trait in relation to most other individuals. He lives in a way that is consistently different and affects every nook and cranny of his everyday life. And so I believe that it is possible to cultivate those qualities in a way that is enduring. And one of the things that we learn from spiritual practice is the idea of practice, that it actually requires practice in order to transform in these ways. And one of the really important distinctions that comes from modern neuroscience is a distinction between what we call declarative learning and procedural learning. Declarative learning is learning about stuff. So we can learn the value of certain virtues, but that will not necessarily make us a virtuous person. We can instruct the person about the value of honesty, but it won't make them an honest person. In order to cultivate virtue requires practice. And that kind of practice is something that, in my view, is really central to every spiritual tradition. But I believe that most organized religion, across all religions, including Buddhism, have lost this element of practice. And I think that this is really key to bringing these traditions together.
Thank you. We'll come back. I think we'll come back often here, hopefully, to this issue of practice. It's a very, very key concept for what I hope we can talk about. But I'd like to direct this third question to Hava. In Bereshit, we read that God says, be fertile, increase, fill the earth, master it or have dominion over it, rule the fish in the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on the earth. Does that idea that humanity has free reign to do as it wishes with the world place humans in a totally separate place from the natural world? Does that affect the way that we would see how Judaism might work? And maybe as an addendum to that question, does that kind of language separate us from the scientific imaginations of the world, or is it God's job to maintain the natural world?
So let me answer the first question, and then if you give me another 2 minutes, I will also contextualize it in my own personal story. But
Of course.
I would challenge that the way you pose the question is very problematic, because you only talk about Genesis 1:28, taking it totally out of context. You have to read Genesis 1:28 together with Genesis 2:15, in which the human being is placed in the Garden of Eden, le'ovda u'leshomra, to protect it and to take care of it. So it's not the biblical text telling us to master the world. No, the biblical text tells us two things. Yes, we have the capacity to use the natural resources of the world which God created, but those resources do not belong to the human being. The earth is the Lord, says Psalm 24:1, right? So in other words, the Jewish approach to the natural world is not at all the ethics of dominion, absolutely not. The attitude of the Jewish tradition toward the natural world is the ethics of responsibility and care, and I can go on and on that topic. That's what it's about. And you have to read the biblical text, all of it, not take things out of context, number one. Number two, you have to read the biblical text, all of us Jews have to read the biblical text in light of the tradition that evolved from the biblical text. The Bible is just the beginning. What bugs me in the conversation about that happens so many among Jews and non-Jews, Jews and Christians, that everything ends in Genesis 1, but that's not the Torah. That's not the end of the Torah, right? So what are we doing here? It's just so not right to take things out of context. We look at it in the rabbinic context as a whole. We have to take into consideration halakha, the whole halachic tradition. There's a lot of legislation concerning the natural world. We can talk about that. We need to study philosophy. We need to study Kabbalah. We need to study Hasidism. We need to take all of it into consideration in order to make sense of what it says. So how do I do it? I'm from Israel, in case you haven't identified my accent. So I'm from Israel. I grew up in a kibbutz. I grew up as a socialist. My parents were socialists, of course. But our socialism was not at all devoid or antithetical to Judaism. So it was very open to the Jewish tradition. I study Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah in the Hebrew University. And the bottom line of my approach is all of it is Judaism. All of it is culture. We have to understand Jewish culture in the broadest historical, cultural context or social context possible. And when we do that, we have a pluralistic understanding of Judaism, which doesn't privilege one or the other. It's not Hasidism versus Orthodoxy or Hasidism versus Kabbalah. No, that cannot be. But Hasidism and Kabbalah versus philosophy. No, it's all of the above. So that enables me to look at the biblical text differently from the way you propose.
Thank you. Please, I want to ask our two other panelists to comment on this issue as well.
Yeah, first of all, I love that answer. I feel a little bit like I need to defend Erwin a little bit further. Because I think that he's not the only one who does that. I think that there's a strong tradition in religious traditions of putting humans at the pinnacle, but also as putting them as sort of somehow above the natural world. And it's partly because, we have this divine instruction, to take care of the Garden of Eden, or, in that way. But we also, because we're the ones who created all these religions, we, imagine that we have this special relationship with God, and in that imagining now we are now special because of it. And this is like a recurring theme certainly throughout Jewish traditions. And I think what that leads to has been the type of environmental devastation that we've wrought on the planet. And so it's
complicated because religion is not just part of the problem of the environment. Religion is not just part of the problem of the environmental crisis, it's also part of the solution. I am very much in the midst of this conversation. We've been in it at least for 20 years. So we can go on, and maybe that's another gathering. But let's not put the blame just on religious people, because if all of us, all of the people in America, for example, would think about the natural world as created, as something that doesn't belong to them, imagine how we can have the conversation about climate change if that's the premise. So that the religious premise could be useful rather than prohibitive.
Yeah, just a few points. One is I very much agree with you, Chava, that religion needs to be, and really appropriately is part of the solution with climate change. And in fact, there's a new initiative in our center called the LOCA Initiative, which is intended to bring religious leaders together from multiple faith traditions to engage in this issue. And I think there's a lot to say about the relationship between personal and social transformation pertaining to climate change. And so and it's also the case, it's hard for us in America sometimes to appreciate, but 80% of people on this planet identify as being a member of one or another religious tradition. And given that reality, religion needs to be part of the solution. So with regard to the specialness of human beings, I certainly agree with everything that has been said, particularly Matt's description of this. On the other hand, from my own spiritual practice and tradition that I'm most familiar with, there is something unique and precious about a human birth, and that we do have a capacity for certain kinds of transformation that I don't think is present in any other species. And for that reason, I think that we have a certain kind of responsibility that goes along with that. And it's very important not to squander that opportunity. And so I think that it is helpful to remind ourselves of this unique capacity. It doesn't place us above anything else in nature, but it does confer on us certain kinds of opportunities that are not present at other levels of phylogeny that I think is important to embrace and acknowledge.
Thank you very much. And to those of you out there who are listening and participating, you can be sharpening your questions if you wish, because in about 25 minutes or so, we'll be able to open up the floor and have a chance to ask our panelists some questions. But I'd like to pose this to you all and see what you have to say. Our Torah text is considered very sacred, and yet it is also interpreted by us, and certainly by the rabbis historically. Everyone who studies it interprets it, and so much of our practice is based on this interpretation and Talmudic discourse and argument, and our legacy, of course, includes both. So, how, given that long tradition, the process of science, where we debate and argue about the nature of a problem, the process of interpreting the Torah, where we argue about points of law, are these essentially the same thing and therefore part of a larger whole? Or are there separate ways that we might think about these kinds of attempts to understand?
Let me see if I can get a handle on that. I'll let me put it this way. Human beings have to engage in interpretation. There's just no other way, right, without interpretation. So science has interpretation and religion has interpretation. The question is not about that. The question is, what is the relationship between interpretation and explanation? Science claims to interpret, or scientific method as interpreted in the modern period, maybe today in postmodern environment, it's slightly different. But in the modern period, the claim was that the scientist needs to be totally disinterested so that he can create, or she can create, a certain kind of objective distance between the explanatory process and what needs to be explained and the explanation. That distancing, that objectification does not exist, shouldn't exist in religion. I hope we would agree on that. We are involved, we have to be involved, and we are emotionally involved. So the religious approach, or the spiritual approach, and I think that we, by the way, we need to take a moment to think, why have we changed the language from religion to spirituality? When did this slippage come about? I have an answer to that. It seems to me that it's part of the, I sounded like Elizabeth Warren right but it's, I think that the answer has to do with the post-secular moment. So in the post-secular moment, it's okay to talk about spirituality, but religion is less kosher, religion is less attractive, religion is more of a problem. But the bottom line is that we shouldn't create this schizophrenia, this dichotomy between emotions and reasons. Reasons requires emotions, emotions require reasons, so that's why we have to go for an interdependence or kind of a compatible, complementary model. And that's what this conversation is about.
Well, I can just reflect briefly on this interesting question. I would completely agree with Chava. In fact, the brain does not respect the distinction between emotion and thought. That is a constructed fiction that has, I think, had pernicious consequences in a variety of domains, but it is not our nature at all. I think that this issue of the kind of scientific objectification, as Chava put it, I think in the human sciences, in the mind sciences in particular, I think that that kind of objectification actually has gotten us into a lot of trouble and has led us to ask the wrong kinds of questions, or at least ask questions in ways that are not as penetrating and as insightful as they might be. And so scientists are perceiving, experiencing organisms and who have consciousness, and to somehow deny that, and to deny what Matt began with, which I think is extremely important, which is that we are constantly interpreting the world, constructing the world, and there really is, in some, in terms of human experience, that is all that there is. That is all that there is. It is a constructed reality. There is no direct access to anything other than that. And so when we acknowledge that in a very serious way, we can then begin to incorporate that into our science. And if we are going to study certain kinds of questions, it will require that the scientist, her or himself, actually have practiced certain kinds of disciplines which enable them to see things in a particular way and to be explicit about that. And there are certain scientists who, by dint of their circumstances, are simply unable to perceive things in a particular way, and therefore will ask very different questions. And so I think this is another way in which science and spirituality not only can mesh together, but in certain ways it is a necessity for us to fully understand the full capacity of human flourishing.
Yeah, well put. I think that I think one of the pernicious constructed fictions in science is that it's possible to be completely objective in science, and I mean I run up against that every day when I read papers. It's often obvious to a casual reader of a scientific paper what the biases of the people who wrote the paper are, and so it, as Richie said, it's a problem, but it's also an opportunity. I mean, certainly you can do better science if you acknowledge that and if you are able to keep that in perspective when you're interpreting your data, and the humility that Richie spoke about as well, which, by the way, is often hard to find in academic science. And the reason for that, of course, is because you spend your professional life banging your head against the wall and failing, 99 times out of 100, and it's kind of hard to do that without considerable ego to keep you going. So it's certainly it's a problem within the scientific method that we need to acknowledge and that we need to take into account.
Thank you. Many people use practices like meditation to help improve their sense of self, and the sense of self is recognized, I think, in science as a construct. It's a collection of stories we tell about ourselves. They may not be physically part of our brain or body. We may use practices such as this, psychotherapy, mindfulness, meditation, to help redefine our narrative, the narrative of ourselves, and to try to reorient our lives. To the panel, can religious and spiritual practice realign our sense of self? And are there scientifically verifiable pathways that spiritual practice can impact in this way? Richie, maybe I'll ask you.
I'll be happy to start. I think that this is really a very interesting set of questions. And I would begin by suggesting that the way to frame it is not so much about changing the narrative or I forget.
I said, redefine the narrative or reorient our lives.
Yeah, it's really, I think the first and most important step is to understand deeply, experientially, what the nature of this narrative actually is. To have insight into the narrative as a narrative. And so, so this is the first and most important step, and I would say it's not so much, therefore, about changing the narrative as it is to appreciate the nature of the narrative, to change our relationship to the narrative. Most of the time, we never ask the question even about whether there is a narrative. We just take the narrative for granted as a definition of who we are. And there are certain practices that I'm very familiar with in the Buddhist tradition that directly tackle the nature of this narrative and do, and their goal is to undermine, in many ways, the narrative as a veridical description of who we are. And that is a set of practices designed to change our relationship to the narrative. And so, and it's difficult to overestimate how important this is, because from some perspectives, this is the most important route of suffering. It is because we reify this narrative. It is because we grasp onto this narrative and usually do it completely unconsciously. That is the root of so much human suffering. And if we can change our relationship to this narrative, it offers the possibility of a certain kind of freedom and liberation. And so I think that there are many spiritual practices that in one way or another are designed to do this, and they're just beginning to be studied in scientific terms. And I certainly wouldn't want to oversell the evidence for this at this point in time, but it is, I believe, a scientifically tractable question that can be approached in a rigorous way. So I'll stop there. I'm sure others have.
May I challenge you a little bit?
Please do.
We call ourselves Jews. That's a narrative. How can a Jew practice Buddhism with a kind of critical apparatus that you just proposed and remain Jewish without saying, forget about this Jewishness? That's a narrative that I got from my parents, from my growing up in Brooklyn, from whatever. Why do I need all that? I have access to truth through the sutras. Would your relationship to the Talmudic text be the same relationship as you have with the sutra that you know well?
I think the issue here is not about throwing anything out. It is not, as I said earlier, it's not about changing the narrative. It's about appreciating the narrative for what it is. Narratives are stories. They're thoughts that we have about ourselves. They're not, and they're fundamentally no different than any other thought. And if we can deeply experientially understand that, it will have dramatic impact on our experiences in the world.
Yes, but I come from a kibbutz. I grew up narratives from here to whatever, right? It was strongly ideological. I don't want to give up that. If I,
It's not a question of giving up.
but it's a question of distance.
No.
Diffusing.
Which one?
Diffusing, where
Diffuse,
you
okay.
don't take it so seriously.
Don't take it so seriously. Relax. I mean, you're not really the kibbutznik you are. You are many, many, many other things. In other words, I'm fully with you on the merit of Buddhist practice. I understand what you're saying. On some level, I even experienced it myself. But I can also see that once you begin to say, well, this is not really something I need to latch onto because Buddhism, after all, is about detachment. So don't get yourself too detached to your Jewishness. Don't get yourself too detached to your kibbutznik background, your Israeli background, this background and that background. And what remains at the end, your entire story is basically deconstructed. It's a major problem that we have. Why you are one of the Jews who is in the synagogues. Most Jews are not.
Yeah. So again, I wouldn't say it's anything. We don't have to give up anything. We don't have to give up our stories. We have to understand them as stories. And that really is the practice. And so it's not about giving up this beautiful story that you described of your kibbutz origins. And it's not about me giving up my story about being Jewish. It is simply understanding the nature of these narratives for what they are. So, we have a tendency, I think, when we think about narratives, that we think that there are certain, and there are certain traditions which are telling us to change these narratives. But what I'm inviting as another possibility is we actually don't need to change the narratives. We simply need to understand what they are in a very deep way as narratives. This can be enormously beneficial, I believe, for our capacity to flourish as human beings.
Yeah,
You'll resolve.
well, a little bit. So I think so. I'll start with a personal story, and that is that I had a difficult relationship with my father as a kid, and I still recognize that relationship coming up in my experience as an adult. And one of the ways that I've been able to, most of the time, definitely not all the time, engage with that story in a more positive way is by virtue of practice to recognize it as just a story that is one of many stories that has sort of molded the person that I am. And to say that, look, I don't really need to be that little boy anymore in this moment. I can put that aside. And so I think that it's certainly something that I haven't changed. change, like that story hasn't changed at all, but because of practice, I'm better able to engage with it. But I also think that then leads to changing the story itself. And so I very much resonate with Rishi with what you said, is that the first step is to recognize that it is just a story, because when these stories come up, they are powerful. They express themselves in terms of as powerful emotions, and they feel like solid. They feel like there is nothing else in the world right now except for whatever it is that's happening in this moment. And this is exactly who I am, and there's nothing else. And so recognizing that they're actually made of nothing more, as you said, than thought stuff is a powerful practice. One of the projects that I've recently become involved with in my professional life is trying to understand the origins of depression and anxiety and substance use disorder. And those three things might seem unrelated in many ways, but they all relate to narratives of the self that people have that have become pretty negative aspects of their lives. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to try to understand that, but also try to understand how particular medications might be able to allow people to recognize that there are other possible narratives that they can tell about themselves, and there are other aspects of their lives that they can focus on or emphasize. Whether or not that narrative ever actually goes away, sort of expanding the realm of possibility can be a powerful therapeutic treatment.
So I'm very intrigued by this last comment. Tell me, how do you explain to the layperson that medication, which is a certain biochemical compound, affects narrative and affects self-understanding? How does chemical become thought?
How much time we have? So it's a fascinating question. So actually, these particular research projects actually focus on using psychedelics as medicines. So drugs like psilocybin and ayahuasca and other substances that actually have long history of spiritual use or use in a spiritual context. And they certainly have particular effects on the brain, which are complicated, and we're just trying to unravel them now, for example, using animal models. They also have profound experiential consequences when you take them. And the empirical data indicates that even a single dose of some of these substances can have lasting beneficial effects for people, for example, with depression or anxiety or substance use disorder. The connection between the biochemical and molecular mechanisms of these drugs' actions in the brain and these long-term changes in behavior is one of the goals of the project. But I can give you one possible explanation, and that is that these drugs all have in common that they act on serotonin receptors in the brain. Serotonin is, of course, a major player in the world of mental illness. Most treatments for depression and anxiety, for example, are specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which means that you have more serotonin floating around in your brain. Any drug that, or any substance that acts on serotonin receptors, the theory at least is, and there's data to support this, promotes synaptic plasticity, which means it promotes structural changes in the brain that we experience all the time when we learn things, for example, or when we forget things. And so these drugs are acting at the cellular level to promote synaptic plasticity. But my personal hypothesis is that that's not enough, that there has to be something else that also happens at the same time. And so, just to step back, if you provide for structural changes in the brain, then you can imagine that you'd actually be able to create different stories about yourself or to relate to the stories that you have in a different way, because your brain is actually changing the way it responds when those things come up. But the psychedelics themselves have these powerful, they promote these powerful experiences, which I think is actually separate from these structural changes that they allow for. And it's those experiences that sort of open your eyes to all the different possible narratives or many other alternative narratives that you could have about yourself. And that once you come down from the effects of these drugs, then you're able to, because of this plasticity, you're able to say, okay, I want to tell a different story, or I want to engage with the stories that have come up in a different way.
Let me just add one footnote to this in response to Chava's point, and that is that I think if we scientists are really honest with ourselves, the very deep question which I think you were asking, which is how is it that the material matter of the brain gives rise to experience, I would say that we have not made any progress, real progress on that in the last 100 years. Zero.
That's good to hear on the one hand. On the other hand, I have to remind all of us that some people think that technology has changed the nature of the game. So you have to say something about AI in order to give more evidence to what you were saying, because it seems like AI is actually contradicting what you just said.
I'm not sure how AI is contradicting what I just said, but I mean, AI is a tool. The details of how the material substance of the brain actually gives rise to experience, philosophers have called the hard problem. And I don't really believe that neuroscience has made a dent in that hard problem. If we're really honest with ourselves, in the modern era. And so AI or not AI, I don't think AI helps us to address this problem at all. AI is a tool.
Well, they claim they do.
Well, maybe, I'm assuming you're referring to synthetic consciousness. So the possibility of actually creating creatures that are conscious.
No, I'm referring to creating, to basically building a super intelligent machine that will be self-conscious. That's what transhumanism is all about.
Well, I mean, if that's the issue, I don't think we're even remotely close to that. So.
Well, I don't know enough about it to weigh in on that, but there are many people who actually think we are quite close to it. But I think that actually gets at exactly what the point that Richie was making, in that, as a scientist who actually studies the neural basis of consciousness, it's one of the reasons that it's such a hard problem to study is because it's unclear to me whether we would be able to actually evaluate or recognize consciousness in a synthetic creature or not, because we understand so little about it. And so, some people might say, oh, well, this thing is not conscious, and others might say, well, yes, clearly it is. I would say that I was at a meeting in Canada several months ago in which Thomas Metzinger, who's a sort of a prominent figure in the world of synthetic consciousness and AI, he argued that we should have a ban on any attempts to create synthetic consciousness for the next 50 years, and he was part of the team working in the European Union on sort of regulating these technologies. And what I thought was so beautiful about his argument was that one of his primary arguments was that he said that because it's likely, given human nature, that we would create these synthetic beings and then make them suffer, it was unethical for us to actually create them.
Maybe this is a fascinating conversation. We're right at the time when we could open this up for to you for questions, and I'm sure there are questions. So so I don't know how to decide, but I'll start on this side of the room, and we'll move towards you. And please be succinct because our time is limited. Thank you.
So there is no serious discussion without devil's advocate, and I'd like to play this role. So I'm a physician. I had quite a bit of experience with medical sciences. I would argue that on day-to-day level, when you're you're a scientist, you have to separate yourself from religion. You can have one hat as a scientist and go back and practice religion later, but you cannot really reconcile it. Judaism is easier than Catholicism, at least it doesn't make you believe in Immaculate Conception, resurrection, and for physicians the most amazing is sainthood declarations when you have to have two medical miracles. But for me, and the best proof for me of it would be looking at Nobel Prizes. If you look at Nobel Prizes in medicine and physiology, physics and chemistry, the number of Jews is amazing. It's both American Jews and Israelis, and I actually know Israeli Nobel Prize laureates. And Israelis say the religion we don't practice is Orthodox. So I think none of them is observant.
Thank you.
Hanover is, Ada is not.
Does anyone of the panelists want to address the comment?
So I think that your position is actually where many practicing scientists and medical researchers who are engaged in those questions would probably be with you. That is the norm. What we present here is the exception to the norm. I think that most people will be with you. I agree. Now, one thing we need to bring onto the table, we have not really mentioned that because the question was on meditation, and meditation is practiced in solitude. We did not. That's true. You have the Sangha, and that's kind of the community. But basically, I think that what we need to bring in the social dimension of the spiritual practice. Of what? Yeah, but the social dimension is very important because and sociality means relationships. We have to talk a little bit more about relationality, sociality. That's part of the story. But I think that your question is well taken.
Thank you. Let's keep moving with our questions if we can, and we'll do our best to have some conversation afterwards.
So I just want to go back to the neuroscience part in particular. Just one thing that's always been like nagging at me, and we don't have an answer for, but I'm interested in your perspective if you think there might ever be an answer for how you reconcile it in your own minds, is the concept of the soul.
That should be an easy one.
I'll address that in 2 minutes or less. Of course, the question requires some definition of what you might mean by soul, but I sort of will take it as a placeholder. And this is a kind of question that the Dalai Lama asks us scientists all the time. And for those who are really interested in his perspective on this, I would urge you to read. He's written a book on science and spirituality called The Universe in a Single Atom. And I would strongly urge you to read that because he very much takes this on very explicitly. He'll talk to scientists. In fact, my wife and I just got back from Dharamsala, India, just a few days ago, where we were with the Dalai Lama, and he brought up the issue of reincarnation again, which has some elements of soul in it. And here I would basically plea with scientists not to have a knee-jerk reaction and respond with scientific hegemony, and rather just simply acknowledge not knowing. This is really what I do my best to practice and try to inculcate this in my students. We, a few years ago, had one of these other convenings with the Dalai Lama and scientists, and a very, very, very prominent neuroscientist, one of the most famous living neuroscientists today, was at this meeting, and basically he said, after hearing stories about phenomena which are not possible to reconcile with our current scientific understanding, basically said that if anything that you've just said in the last 15 minutes is true, we're in big trouble. And I think we need to not dismiss that with a knee-jerk reaction. And These are very sane people, I believe, who are not, new agey, woo-woo, staring in crystals. They've dedicated their life to study, and they have a very different understanding of the nature of reality than most of us do. And I think at this point in time, we just don't know. And I think that's the most appropriate stance.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Quick comment, then the question. As a psychologist, I separate the stories, the narratives, into helpful ones and unhelpful ones, and I think that usually gets rid of we have to get rid of this narrative. No, you could hold the unhelpful ones lightly, you can't not have them, but you could take the helpful ones more seriously. But the question is, when we say science in the synagogue, we're talking about Jews, Buddhists, folks who have an open mind and more of a non-literalist. But if you're talking the more general science versus religion, how about all of these apocalyptic religions that in the James Watt tradition, we don't care about the environment. It's all going to be done in a couple of years anyway. So if that's that, if you separate religions from spiritual, open-minded to these literalist, I can't say. I'm not going to say anything bad. But what is that? My question is, how do you put those two
I'll
together?
come that way. I have one right here. I'll come that way. Please, go ahead.
Maybe this is a question.
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
you're right. There is a challenge here, but I want to tell you that here in Madison, Wisconsin,
Oh yeah.
you have a chance of meeting one of the most important Christian evangelical environmentalists. Right here, his name is Calvin DeWitt. I told Erwin I want him, if I'm here. He's terrific. So bring Calvin to the synagogue. Let him talk to you. He comes from the left wing of the evangelical movement, and he's done marvelous work about Christianity and religion. So please don't accept the simplistic presentation of either Christianity or any other religion. And you're right, apocalypticism is part of the problem, literalism is part of the problem, but we have it in Judaism and every other tradition has it, including, I'm sure, Buddhism.
Thank you.
I have a comment, a question rather for Dr. Banks. My wonderment is whether any studies have been done on the effect of the repeated hitting your head against the wall when you're a graduate student has on the brain damage of the future scientist. My other comment is, more seriously, can any narrative exist without interpretation of that narrative because of the plasticity of the brain?
This is your prelim, Matt.
So, again, I mean, all we have, I think Richie made this point before, all we have is our experience. And that's the only thing that we can be sure of. And every experience that we have is seen through the lens of all the other experiences we've had in the past. And so the answer is, all of our narratives are then reinterpreted and we spin new stories about them as they happen. And in fact, that is also very much bound up in the notion of suffering, in that we have these narratives arise, and then we immediately sort of go to all sorts of crazy places with them. I had this experience just the other day when I put my winter biking pants on for the first time this year, and they were so big on me that I actually had to wear a belt, which I had not done last year. And my first thought was, oh, this is so nice. I've lost so much weight, and almost immediately my second thought was, oh my God, I wonder if I have cancer. So that's just the roller coaster of our experience.
Can I say, James, I think what's at stake here, I want to connect this question with the first question over here. Both of you talk epistemologically. But the question that you asked about the soul and this question is really about ontology. Neither of you have mentioned the word transcendence, which both religion and spirituality is all about. So the question is, and that's I think what you're driving at, is there a reality that is not just constructed in the brain? That's what's at stake. Can there be an ontological response to the challenge? So the question on the soul is, given in a given tradition, which ontology is presupposed? The soul is a product of Platonic ontology. Aristotle had a different response to the question, what is the soul? Different from Plato. So we need to learn all of that, and then always contextualizing. It's always culture dependent or context dependent.
So it seems to me that this discussion is also taking place in the parallel universe, so that we don't know what's happening with that discussion in this parallel universe, according to modern physics. So if indeed there is such a thing, these are theoretical constructs. Now, we have no way at this point of actually testing whether these parallel universes actually exist, but they do answer certain questions in modern physics as to a possibility. Now, it seems to me when we talk about, and I'm glad at some point we reached the point where we said that the emotions rest in the brain. And it took a while in this discussion. So if we shut down our brains here, nothing's going on here. So all of this resides ultimately in the brain, and it is a question of to the extent to which we can ultimately understand the brain before we can answer a whole bunch of questions. Now, you are making progress, and indeed, the fact that there are drugs that affect the narrative, okay, and affect our emotions, means that we should not place too much confidence in the narratives per se. So we have to be very careful about overplaying the narratives. And this is my difficulty with Kabbalah, with narratives, with the whole shtick that goes along with it. So it is fun to construct narratives. It is fun to play the Kabbalah game. You allow your imagination to flourish while doing this. It is all a lot of fun. Is this reality? Is this science? Is this truth? Okay? Ultimately, I think it'll be a question of the extent to which we will ultimately understand all these neurons which are in there, which are so darn complex, and there are so many of them that we are only beginning to understand them. So humility toward this whole discussion here is absolutely a requisite. So this is my say.
Well said. Would any of the panelists want to make time for one more question or maybe two more questions? So maybe a quick response from the panel?
Somebody behind you
Sure,
really wants to ask.
So I just want to push back on one small thing, and that is that as a neuroscientist, I know for a fact that emotions don't just manifest in the brain. That you have to take into account the body as a whole, and you also have to take into account the trillion or so microorganisms we have growing in and on our body. We are actually an entire metropolis ecosystem walking around, and our experience and our mind is a manifestation of all that and all of our interrelationships with everyone else and everything else.
Thank you, Matt. We have maybe two more questions here before we let our panelists make some concluding comments.
I've been chomping at the bit since you started talking about all of this, because early this morning, I'm a once-a-week Facebook person, and early this morning I read this on my Facebook feed, and I just have to share it, and I'm going to stand up so you can hear me. This is a quote by Hubert Reeves. He's a Canadian-French astrophysicist, and the documentation is from IGI, Science of the Universe. And this is what he said. Man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, unaware that this nature he's destroying is the God he's worshiping.
Would any of the panelists like to comment? Judith.
Okay, so I actually have something that ties into that, but also gets at a point that Matt made very early on about the nature, that there might be some ultimate reality out there. And also this concept that Erwin asked very early on about the idea of human dominion. I'd like you to move away from the anthropocentrism that we've heard in our discussion. And those of us who study in realms where we are aware of and looking into communication among other species, chemical communication among plants and bacteria, for example, other sensory modalities that humans don't have access to, but, for example, the sensitivity to the magnetic fields of the earth, that there are many organisms that do have sensitivities to. We're a species that's constructed a world that is built and maintains us to the, we can argue about whether humans are flourishing beautifully, but they're flourishing a whole lot better than a lot of other things. And there's something that's intrinsically anthropocentric about everything you're talking about, and I wonder if you could talk more broadly to the rest of the biosphere.
I mean, I applaud and welcome that broadening of the perspective, and certainly would agree that the communication in the human realm is a tiny fraction of the kind of interactions which we know exist among other species. And I also think that more and more is being discovered about the further ranges of human sensitivity. And there are, we are very sensitive to olfactory cues in ways which we may not consciously recognize, but clearly impact our behavior and our biology in all kinds of ways. So I think all of those are helpful comments. I think that the question of whether there is this ultimate reality, if you will, beyond our construction is certainly a question which is shared among the world's religions, and I think that you will find probably responses that are not too different among different religious traditions in suggesting that there may well indeed be some kind of ultimate reality that can be described in certain terms that do share some commonality. And I think that these are questions which we don't even know how to address in a scientific way at this point in time. So this is a helpful opening, and there's still, I think this helps encourage a kind of humility about all that we don't know.
Thank you. We have one more question here, and I apologize that I can't get to everybody who wants to ask a question, but there will be plenty of time for conversation. We're going to have one additional question, and then we're going to give the panel members a couple of minutes each to make some concluding comments.
So I was, something tweaked my thinking of the slight disagreement between the two of you when you challenged Richie about being a Jubu of sorts. The two words that came to my mind were consumerism, that we humans think we can dabble in everything, and finitude of our capacity, or would you say we have infinite capacity to hold everything?
What exactly is the question that you want to ask?
I mean, I guess I was just trying to think in humility, how broad can we really try to how much can we try to encompass? I guess then the question of other species' place in the cosmos rang with all of this.
Yes,
so maybe humility is what you come back to.
Yeah, so I think it's a good idea indeed to combine those two questions. And I have to say that in the ecological literature today, we don't talk about the human versus the non-human or the human versus nature. We talk about the human and the more than human, right? The category, the more than human, as you can imagine, was coined by a Jew. And that's David Abram, and he's a ecophenomenologist, and he came up with that term in the book, The World of the Sensuous, or something like that, 1994, I believe it was. And most of us take the notion of interdependence, interconnectedness for granted. However, I still believe, and here I share the humanism that you claim is too anthropocentric. I share it by saying that I still cannot think like a bat, right? That's the famous book by Thomas Nagel. So I don't think like a bat. I can only think like a human. I am limited by this construct that is humanly evolved, or that evolved to be this human. So that's my downfall, but that's also the glory of the human. So the challenge to all of us is how to be more humane in our treatment of everything around us. We don't talk about being more like a snake or a coyote or a fox or whatever, right? We talk about being more like human. We don't have anything else available to us.
But God can be in all, or whatever this reality is, He's in all of these.
Fair enough, but we are not God. We are not God, and we cannot even think. We cannot even imagine what it means to be God. So that goes back. So the question that we haven't dealt with, because we're not approaching it theologically, is what's the place of transcendence in this conversation? What has been presented here is basically an immanentist approach. But actually, the traditional Jewish approach focuses on transcendence. One way to solve the problem is to talk about panentheism. So God is in everything, but God is not exhausted. But there's always this extra, right? So we have theism, pantheism, panentheism, and other various ways of trying to make sense of it. For example, process theology. One way to solve many of our problems is by adopting process thought. Whitehead, anything, right? The philosophy of Whitehead can get us a long way in the right direction. A lot of people think that that in science and Judaism conversation, we need to approach from the perspective of process theology, of process philosophy. A new book that came out, which would be interesting for many of you, is Bradley Shavit Artson, a conservative rabbi. The title of the book is The God of Becoming and Relationship. The God of Becoming and Relationship, that's a way to talk about Jewishness or Judaism from the perspective of process theology, of process thought. It's a very useful book in which he deals with all of the questions that we are struggling with here.
Thank you. Thank you. We're at a point now where we're going to give each panelist a couple of minutes to provide some concluding thoughts before we finish our event here. And I think we'll start with Matt, if you're ready, Matt, to make a few concluding comments.
Sure. So I actually took a few notes here. So I very much resonate with the notion of process theology. For those of you who read my Friday emails, I often talk about the eternal unfolding of being. And Eliezer Diamond, when he was here and gave his drash on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, talked about finding a name for God. What he meant was a concept for God that you can connect to. And for me, that's very much the Tetragrammaton, Yud-He Vav-He, which is itself an impossible construction of the verb to be. And so for me, understanding God as a process and as a process of which we are all part has gone a long way to allow me or encouraging me to reconcile the different aspects of my life from science to Judaism to my Buddhist-inspired meditation practice. And so in that sense, I don't have to take off my Jewish hat when I'm in the lab, because what I understand I'm doing as a scientist is the same thing that I'm enjoined to do as a Jew, and that is to discover creation in each moment, and that each moment of my experience, whether it's in the lab or whether it's riding a bike, is my job is to observe and to find the specialness of that moment and what unfolds in that moment. often in the lab, that specialness is figuring out how to deal with failure. And then every once in a while, there's some beautiful thing that we discover or see that nobody else has ever seen before. And so I think that from my perspective, the notion that we as scientists somehow cannot be Jewish or cannot be observant Jews is to really ignore a lot of the teachings of Judaism that I've had all my life. One of my meditation teachers, Rabbi Jordan Ben Appel, used to talk about Judaism's endogenous mindfulness technologies. And that is that you're supposed to say a blessing before you take anything into your mouth, and you're supposed to say a blessing of gratitude after you eat it. That the whole notion of avodah, of practice, is not to do it out of habit, out of rote, but to actually find meaning in each manifestation. Each time you say the Amidah and express gratitude for all the miracles of this experience, what I think about aren't the miracles of the Bible. I think of the miracles of birth. I think of the miracles of how a neuron can operate, and I think of the miracles of dark energy and all sorts of things about the universe that we're just beginning to understand.
Thank you, Matt. Richard, please.
In order to appreciate the sacredness of every moment in everyday life, requires practice. And we can read all the books that are available, we can attend lectures, we can convene in these ways. This will help in providing a perspective of view, but in order to transform everyday life so that we can actually discover the sacredness in every moment requires practice. When human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. This is something that virtually every human being on the planet now does. It is not part of our genome. We do this because we recognize that it is important for our personal physical hygiene. If every human being devoted even as short a time as they spend brushing their teeth to nourishing their mind, to actually practicing, discovering the sacredness of everyday life, this world would be a very different place. And so my conclusion and plea is to take this notion seriously. I think of it as nothing short of an urgent public health need, which has the capacity to transform our planet. And really, I believe is the only way that transformation of a deep sense will occur. But this will require a shift. And so it's not enough to pray, and it's not enough to attend convenings like this. We need to practice every single day in our lives.
Thank you. Chava, you get the last word.
So I will make the last word, the word of a public intellectual, and kind of preach to the converted in some ways. So I want Jews to be informed. I want to have Jews who are culturally educated, who are scientifically open, who are religiously attentive. And I say that because I'm afraid that that's not the direction we're going in American Judaism. So I see much greater and unfortunate, in my view, polarization, not just in America in general, but also in the Jewish community. As a cultural historian, I accept the diversity and inherent pluralism of Judaism, but I'm very concerned about the drifting away from the Jewish community. I'm concerned about secularists, precisely the people that you represented in the first question that you asked, who really are not involved in the Jewish community, and that really pains me. I'm very concerned about intellectual poverty of a lot of our teachers, a lot of even our rabbis, unfortunately, I find issues there. And I would like to see the leadership within the Jewish community in America more engaged scientifically, culturally, historically, and also emotionally, and shall we say, spiritually. So I think we are in a very precarious moment. I'm not very optimistic about what's waiting for us. But I think that if we have more gatherings like this one, more activities that are easily done here in an academic community such as Madison, Wisconsin, but very difficult to do outside of an environment like that. So if we have more of these, we will be in a better place. So thank you for hosting it.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our allotted time for discussion, and I would like to just take a moment to thank our panelists, Chava Tirosh Samuelson, Richie Davidson, Matt Banks, who did just a beautiful job with some very complex subject matter. Let's take a moment to thank them all. There will be time for more discussion, but I would like to turn the floor over to our congregation president, give a few words here before we reconvene in the social hall for some refreshments.
Good morning. I'm Rick Gazelle, president of Beth Israel Center. And wonderful programs like this do not happen without the efforts of a lot of people. And I want to extend some thanks to those people. Erwin's already mentioned Chava Tirosh Samuelson, Erwin himself for moderating this morning's program. And he also did much of the work behind the scenes to pull it together. Matt Banks for his participation this morning and his work on the Scientists and Synagogues programming throughout the year. And Richie Davidson for his insights and expertise on today's panel. We also need to thank the Sinai and Synapses organization and the John Templeton Foundation for their support and funding. This program concludes our participation in the Scientists and Synagogues project, which has also included 4 book discussions, a teen Shabbaton, 4 colloquial talks by scientists in our synagogue, and the 5779 Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And there's one more special component of this program. I hope you will join us for more conversation and some delicious treats in the social hall, and join me in thanking Han Bernard Donalds, Marty